Did you know that there is a Swedish village in Ukraine called Gammalsvenskby? Who are these people really? And what is happening in the village right now during the present conflict with Russia? Today we have as our guest Jörgen Hedman, who is a historian, who is also has written many books about Gamasvensky, and we are very happy to have you here today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a beginning? Who are you and how did it come that you become interested in the Swedish people in Ukraine?
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jörgen Hedman. I'm a senior high school teacher here at the German school in Stockholm, and I have been interested in the fate of the Estonian Swedes, and I have been studying their history since the 1980s, and I have written several books about them. My actual interest started with the Swedes of Estonia, and then I, so to say, tracked them down to Gammalsvenskby or Smigivka or Starosvedskaya or Alt-Schwedendorf, which this village is called.
Can you tell us about a little bit about the history of Gammalsvenskby? How did the inhabitants come to Gammalsvenskby in Ukraine and why, and the history before that? It's a long story, I know, but if you can say something.
Yes, well, we have to go back far in history, back to the medieval age in the 13th and 14th century, when Swedes populated the islands of the Estonian coast, and the northern part of Dagö or Hiiumaa in Estonian got its Swedish population. And this Swedish population had civil rights and had it better off than the Estonians, and they prospered there until the 1620s, when the island was given to the noble family of De la Gardie here in Sweden. And then there was a fight between the landowner, the De la Gardian family, and the Swedish peasants started. And this fight continued also after the province of Estonia had become Russian in 1710. And it really took off in the late 1770s, when also the Swedes were evicted or noticed to be evicted, and that started a legal quarrel, and they got the chance to emigrate. And when it came to emigration from Dagö in 1781, there was no voluntarily immigration in that. They were sent down to the south of Russia, as it was called then, and they were given land to colonize by the Empress Catherine the Great, and they were escorted by Russian militaries down, and their voyage lasted for about half a year, and about 50% of the people that left Dagö died on the road down to Gammalsvenskby. They came there in 1782, and they founded their village the 1st of May in 1782.
Yeah, well, they came to Gammalsvenskby then, and when they arrived there, they had a long history, I know that, and then they also came back to Sweden during the 1929 and so forth. Can you develop something about or tell us more about the history after they arrived to Gammalsvenskby. It's a long history. I know that also, but yes.
I will take it just in a few points. There were very few that survived this transportation and the first years in Gammalsvenskby. Actually, there were only 135 people alive in 1783. And some newly come people also settled in the village, some people from Danzig in Prussia, some Swedish prisoners of war, and also some Germans who came down and founded the neighboring villages at that time. So they were not alone there down on the steppe of Ukraine. And actually, the village people, they had quite a good time in the 18 or 1900s, and they were quite a lot used to the new art of living, and they multiplied. And in the 1870s, there was a shortage of land, and they tried to get the neighboring village Germans to get evicted, but it didn't succeed. And also then in the 1880s, an immigration started with the people moving out from the Swedish village to Siberia, but also to Canada. And that took a bit of the pressure from this rising number of inhabitants in the village. Then they lost their freedom from military conscripts, and the Swedes took part in the Russian-Turkish War in 1876, in the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, and also in the First World War in 1914. And in 1917, the Russian Revolution took place, and that started, so to say, a new art form of living for the Swedes. The Bolsheviks nationalized the land in the villages. The Swedish school was threatened with that they had to just teach in Russian, and there was also a threat to close down the Swedish church and get the Swedish priest banned from his position there. And then they started to investigate if there was a possibility to emigrate to Sweden. And it just turned out that the Moscow, the Soviet authority in Moscow said yes. The local authorities in Ukraine said no, but Moscow decided. So almost everybody from the village left Gammalsvenskby in 1929, in the summer of 1929, and came to Sweden that summer.
Okay. Can you tell us the location of Gammalsvenskby in Ukraine?
Well, it's situated along the Dnieper River, which runs through Ukraine. It's about 80 kilometers north of Persson. I think it's 30 kilometers from Kherson down to the actual Black Sea, but it's some 110 kilometers from the Black Sea along the Dnieper River, and it's situated on the left side of the river.
Okay. And what about the culture of the people in Gammalsvenskby? How has the culture developed?
It's an archaic society that interested the scientific researchers here in Sweden a lot when they came in 1929. They have their own Eastern Swedish dialect that is also, I think, it's connected to the Finland Swedish dialects, and it's a dialect that is quite hard to understand for the regular Swede. It's a bit like the Swedish spoken in Dalarna and on Gotland. They had their own folk tradition. Their their so to say, the folklore with their own beliefs on minor people living on underground and so on. And it was also a very patriarchal society with a man in the house deciding over, so to say, a larger family. The village consisted of some 900 inhabitants, and they looked upon each other as a big family, actually. So until 1929, there were no large difference between the rich and the not that fortunate people living in the village. No hard feelings between the, so to say, the employer and the hired worker there. They were Lutherans since the time in Estonia, and they also often, when the time when they did not have their own reverend or clergy, they were visited by German priests from other villages. And so the church books that we still have kept from the foundation of the village in 1781, they are mostly kept in German. Most of the people spoke fluent German, Swedish, Ukrainian, Russian, and there was also a Jewish neighbor village. So several of them also spoke Yiddish then. So they could also be useful as translators to others traveling along the Dnieper River, for example.
Okay, I have heard that I have understood that they had a very hard time during Joseph Stalin's rule, and during the collectivization first, and then during the Second World War, and when they came back and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about that Stalin period and so forth?
Yes. One of the reasons to leave Ukraine in 1929 was the threat of the collectivization. It hadn't started yet when they left, but it started the same winter. And 243 people went back to Ukraine in 3 different groups. And when they came back, there was a collective farm, Svenska Kommunistpartiet, the Swedish Communist Party called, and there were Swedish communists sent from Sweden to help them to start it. They got in the period where the starvation called Holodomor was set up in Ukraine to get rid of the last wealthy farmers, the kulaks. And some people also starved to death in Gammalsvenskby. And by then they wanted to return to Sweden a second time. And as they wrote a letter about this, they got, so to say, they got the eyes of the KGB on them, and some 24 adults were arrested and also were killed during the Stalin time in 1937-38. In 1941, then the German army came to the Ukraine, and almost everybody, Ukrainians, Swedes, German, and also the Jews, were saluting the German army and hoping that they would have it better off with the Germans. The Germans kept the collective farms, and the German army, so to say, clashed quite heavily with the local people, also the Germans living there. And everybody saw it as a really hard time also during the German occupation. And in 1943, the threat of the Russian return, the Red Army return, brought it to that the German army evacuated all the German and also the Swedish village back to East Germany, or the eastern part of Germany, or western part of Poland by then. So they ended up in the eastern part of Germany in 1944 and 1945. As then the Russians came back, they saw it as traitors, Russian or Soviet citizens being voluntarily in Germany. And so men were sentenced to 25 years in labor camps, and women and children to 15 years in labor camps. So almost everybody of the Swedes ended up in Komi, USSR, in the north of Russia, on this side, so to say, not in Siberia, but on the Russian side, but far north. And they spent almost a year there, and then they were pardoned and they could return back to their village. And so since 1947, they are back in their old village, along with all other people who moved in there when they, so to say, were absent from their village.
I read during these last happenings, the invasion, that there are still people there who speak Swedish. And could you talk a little bit about the current situation after the invasion, what has happened, and how are the people there now?
Yes. At first, in 2014 and 2015, the Russians took Crimea, and it's quite near. It's 75 or 80 kilometers to new border against the Russian Crimea. And on the opposite side of the river from Gammalsvenskby, there's a large power plant, Kashovka, serving the whole of the southern part of Ukraine, and also before 2014, it was serving Crimea with fresh water and electricity. And in February 24, the Russians started their invasion of Ukraine, and they were heading up from Crimea towards Kashovka and this power plant. So they took it by surprise, and it was taken by the Russians, and there were hard fightings over the bridge from Kashovka over to the other side, the town of Berislav. It's closer to Gammalsvenskby. And at the end of March, the Russians had also taken this bridge, and they went along to Persson, which is his district capital here. And I think it was by April 12th, when Russian soldiers first came to Gammalsvenskby, but at that time Gammalsvenskby had been surrounded by the Russians almost for a month. And the first time they arrived, it was quite calm, and they just presented themselves as the new masters, and they wanted to cooperate with the local mayor and so on. But in the beginning of May, at May 4, Russian soldiers appeared for the second time, and now they started to behave quite brutally. They kicked in doors. They were searching for what they called Nazis, and especially Ukrainian war veterans who could have been fighting in Luhansk and the other province in the east. And they were also looting and also hitting people quite hard. And they also came back the second day, and they kidnapped the local mayor, and he's still missing from the village. And in the district capital of Kherson, they have announced that they will have sort of referendum, and they will take it as a part of a new Russian province. And they have also introduced the Russian rubles also in Gammalsvenskby, and they want to stay. And I think that is the main problem right now, that nothing is actually functioning with the capital system. People still have their own Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, and the Russians just want to pay out pension salaries in ruble. So it's quite a chaos right now with the economical situation in the village and so on.
Yeah, and isn't it that it's neighboring Donbass, where there's many Russians and people are more toward Russia and so forth. And in Gammalsvenskby, in this area, they are more Western oriented, maybe. Isn't it so that they're different?
There are very few ethnical Russians in this part of Ukraine. You can't deny that the most of the people living on Crimea are ethnical Russians. But the war in 2014 and 2015 shaped a form of new Ukrainian nationality also among the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. And the majority of people in Kharkov or also in Mariupol and so on are Russian-speaking people, but they, from 2014 and 2015 on, they said, we are Ukrainian Russians. We don't want to be Russians. So actually it formed and shaped a new form of Ukrainian nationality. And of course, in Gammalsvenskby and northwest of Gamasvensky into Ukraine, there are Russian-speaking people. So yes, I think the main intuition or the main position of people is that they are pro-Ukrainian in this part of Ukraine.
I have heard that you have been visiting Gammalsvenskby many times from the 1990s and also afterwards,
Yes.
and get to know people in Gammalsvenskby and so forth. Can you tell us something about your impression about the village and the people you met and so on?
The first time I got there was in 1991, and that was only some weeks after the attempted try to the coup in Moscow, and people were quite, I think, shy, and they didn't want to talk about what happened in the USSR. And with the Gammalsvenskby people, it's like this, that you have to know quite a lot about them before they dare to open up. And with me, I had already written so much about them, and I knew them through the history, that I could tell them things about their forefathers and their parents and so on, and that made me a kind of not that dangerous person. So I got to know quite a lot of the older ones. They are gone now. And the older ones, they were a bit, well, they looked upon their children and grandchildren and they said they can't speak proper Swedish, so it's no idea to speak with them at all. And it turned out, as the old generation was gone, that was not the case. The younger generation understood and spoke quite good Swedish, and they, at least they had their knowledge of being of Swedish nationality. And in those days, back in the USSR and so on, the government made a difference between the ethnic group. So they had passports where it said they were Soviet citizens of Swedish nationality, and they were very proud of being Swedes. And the first thing they told me that every time we see a hockey game with Sweden in it, we go for Sweden and not for the Russia or Soviet Union. So yes, it was quite easy for me to get in touch with them. For others, it was perhaps a bit harder because they are a bit shy towards strangers.
And has that changed over time, you think? Had it been more open with time? Or?
Yes, it has. And already in the 1990s, Swedes came down to Ukraine, building up factories and so on. And it shaped a new generation that was much more open to the Western society. Also that they started to teach English in school, and in Gamasvensky they also started to teach Swedish as a language. And so several young people studied Swedish, and they learned to speak what they called proper Swedish, not the old dialect, but proper nowadays Swedish. So this it shaped a new generation that was much more open to taking on visitors and tourists and so on, and they are used to this type of contact. And the mass media also it opened up, and Ukraine is a much more open and Western-like society than Russia will be also in the future. So yes, it has changed that totally the whole society of Ukraine.
Yes, and many Swedish people are coming to Gammalsvenskby now and visit it. And the king has been coming there also.
Yeah, they used to. And from the 1990s on, there were 25 groups of tourists coming to Gammalsvenskby every year, especially in the summers. And people opened up their homes, and they got paid to take in the visitors on bed and breakfast and so on. So it became part of the economical structure in the village. And this went on until the pandemia in 2019, when everything was shut off. So it's not only the Russian invasion that, so to say, has cut off the links to the relatives and Swedes visiting Ukraine, but it's also the pandemia of COVID-19. So it's very sad to see that this invasion has, so to say, when the pandemia almost was over and we started to look forward to be able to come there again, this invasion has also, so to say, cut off the links totally to this part of Ukraine.
Oh yes, but I have also heard that after the invasion, there have been some people fleeing from Gammalsvenskby to Poland and also to Sweden. Maybe some of your old acquaintances, maybe in Gammalsvenskby, are here, and you have spoken to them. And can you tell me about what they are telling you? And
yes, I can. And for me, as a historian, some 10 or 15 years ago, I got in contact with the people who descended from these Ukrainian Swedes in Gammalsvenskby, but were now living in other parts of Ukraine. And when the war started, they took contact with me and they asked, is there a possibility for us to send our women and children to Sweden? And it started almost immediately then, and up till now, some 10 families with 50 persons in total, 50 people in total, has come to Sweden, the most to Gotland and some others to Stockholm. And altogether from the village, I think there are a couple of hundred people who have been taking refugee in the western part of Ukraine or in Poland. And they hope, the most of them hope to be able to return. And you should know that it's only the women and children who have been able to get out of Ukraine. Then every man over 16 and under 65 aren't allowed to leave the country, and that because of this, then the families are separated. The man is still there, and the women and the children are taking refugee in Poland or in Western Ukraine, or for example here in Sweden.
Okay. Can we speak a little bit about the possibilities of peace in this area, the future possibilities? Because, it's not the way that, the Russians say that the Ukrainian and the Russian are the same people. Of course, they're not the same people. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's also similarities between, they're both Slavic peoples and so forth. So in that sense, they share history and so on. Still, there's this hatred, and so can it be a reconciliation process here, do you think? And how can we see a road to peace really in the future? Can you reflect on that issue?
Yeah. Well, I think I have, and most of the people concerned with the Ukrainian situation has been thinking over that situation, and perhaps it depends on the outcome of this war. It stands quite clear that the Russians want to remain in this southern part of Ukraine, and Russians have their aim in building up another Russian province in the southern part of Ukraine and making it a part of Russia. And if that would be the case, I think it would be very hard for some of the people who has left their homes to return. And I think that could be a problem. There are so large similarities, and the culture is almost the same in this part of Ukraine. And I think that people get along very well with each other normally. Of course, this has started a hatred against the Russians, but it's more against the Russian military and the Russian leadership. And if it could turn out so that the Russians retreated and got back, I think almost everybody in Ukraine are aware of that Crimea is, so to say, lost for Ukraine. Crimea has a majority of Russian-speaking inhabitants. And I think that if the borders could go back to what it was in 2014, 2015, I think there can be a reconciliation between the people. And even though the Russians has been looting, been killing people and raping women and so on in this part of Ukraine, I think that time will heal this kind of sorrow and this kind of wound. And I think there is a possibility to get along, but that depends on whether the Russians are there to stay or to withdraw. If the Persson district would become a part of Russia, I can't see that will be this reconciliation. And I also see that it would be very difficult for some of the people who have fled Ukraine to return to their homes. And that I also see that it would probably be impossible for us Swedes to visit Gammalsvenskby. It would be right in the military boundary section. the large power plant of Kashoka is so vital for the Russians that I think that they could seal off this part of southern Ukraine.
Okay. Well, as a very last question, really, it's a little bit out of this topic, really, but 2 hours ago or something like that, from now on, it was I saw on television that the Swedish government had decided that Sweden should join NATO, really, and Sweden has 200 years of peace, and as a non-aligned country is a part of the national identity somehow. And as a historian, how do you reflect on this new move? What can it mean in the future, I think?
It's very hard to say. The Finnish government decided earlier today that they should join, and I think that it made it impossible for Sweden to stand back. It's very hard to say what this would have for kind of impact on the Swedish-Ukrainian contacts, and especially with the contacts towards Russia, and the on the one hand, I think it could stir up the hostilities between Sweden and Russia, and nowadays I think Ukraine is searching its way towards West, and I think in Ukraine they are only happy that Sweden is joining NATO. I personally, I'm a teacher of civics, and I think there are a lot of things that to worry about in this decision. Actually, when it comes down to reality, I'm not so sure that it has a greater impact. I think the Russians, as well as we, also knew already where we had our standpoint, and I just hope that this doesn't mean that there will be a new kind of iron curtain drawn down on the eastern part of Europe, and I especially hope that this iron curtain not will appear along the Dnieper River, so that Gammalsvenskby and other parts of the southern Ukraine becomes a part of a closed Russia. I think that would be what I fear the most.